He led a crusade for public ownership.
We can not only stave off disaster, but we can have a bright future.
The future, in the end, would pass him by.
It just didn't turn out the way these great cooperators had hoped it would.
Tommy Douglas.
This is a great day for the people of the province of British Columbia. Am I just a tyrant and a Tory dictator? We stand or fall together.
Welcome. I'm Holly Doan. He had a vision, he said. Tommy Douglas was the country's leading advocate of public ownership. Douglas aimed to make Saskatchewan, and then the whole country, a model of state planning. On the prairies, they can still argue whether he was right. We present Tommy Douglas of Saskatchewan.
In 1961, the New Democratic Party held its founding convention. Delegates would choose a leader. The new party liked Saskatchewan Premier Tommy Douglas.
My colleagues and I have established more public ownership than any government in Canada, past or present.
Well, the expectations were that he couldn't miss. This is the greatest premier with the most forward-looking modern government in our history. And on top of that, we're getting a kind, Christian, witty human being.
Combative and outspoken, Douglas had once been an amateur boxer. He said, "I've never been a pacifist."
He was no saint. This was a fighter, and he was willing to fight.
How much socialism will you advocate, and would you practice if given the chance? Would you socialize the steel industry, for instance?
Well, when we talk about socialism or public ownership, we talk of it as part of democratic economic planning.
Douglas had a way of having his way, and if you stood in his way, you'd be run over.
Do you think the Canadian people are really ready for this? Or not so much ready for it, are they prepared to accept it? We're people who like our freedom.
I think the Canadian people know now that they haven't got very much economic freedom.
I was brought up by farmers and brought up by independent people with their own businesses, and they wanted to make their own minds up and do their own thing. They didn't want the government telling them what to do.
Douglas and his cabinet created 20 crown corporations. They cast government into everyday life as no politicians had before. In promising progress with security, their cooperative Commonwealth Federation aimed to create a new society. CCF President Carlisle King said, "We've established a pattern of cooperative living." It applied even to the very young. Saskatchewan children growing to school age were taught the ideals of economic cooperation. In public schools, one social studies course celebrated co-ops and credit unions. The course was called Progress Towards Social Security. There were critics. Monsignor Athol Murray, founder of Saskatchewan's Notre Dame College, condemned the CCF program on radio.
I plead with you to chart your course and the course of your children, the map of their lives, and be determined that these children of yours are going to be individuals of self-determination, not state determination, self-determination, self-realization.
We didn't get the development. And so our population stayed stuck at 1 million for as long as I can remember. In the 30s, the mid to late 30s, Saskatchewan was the third most populous province in Canada. And it stayed exactly where it was back in the late 30s.
30 years ago,
As Premier, Douglas never lost an election. As National Party leader, he would never win one.
I remember asking him once, what would you like to, something about what would you like to see Canada, what's the hope for Canada to be? What do you want it to be? And he said, I would like people one day to look at the top of the North American continent and see this little jewel.
Saskatchewan seemed an unlikely place for adventure. Here, Tommy Douglas sought adventure and idealism, he told a friend. Afterward, his supporters would say, it could only have happened in Saskatchewan.
Douglas was a straight-ahead guy. He really believed that we could make a better world, and we could do it fairly rapidly. And if anywhere this was possible, it was possible in Saskatchewan, because these people were amenable to change, because their past had been so unpalatable.
Douglas's own past was a plain upbringing in a working family. Born in Scotland, raised in Winnipeg, his family voted Labour in the old country. At Winnipeg's Vulcan Iron Works, his father was a tradesman. He was a hard man, the son recalled. My father and I argued about politics at every meal. He was sparing of praise, Douglas said. As a teenager, at 5'5", Douglas took up boxing. He was lightweight champion of Manitoba in 1922, but told a sports writer, I'm built all wrong. My arms are too short. Instead, Douglas became a journeyman printer and joined the Typesetters Brotherhood. He carried the Union card the rest of his life as a souvenir. He had another career in mind.
Only an amazing creature could have had the discipline to do what he did, from the 5 years apprentice in the print shop to university for the 6 years, and paying for that by going out and preaching and doing monologues on the weekend.
Douglas enrolled at a Baptist college in Brandon, Manitoba. His vocation was faith and social work. Douglas said, if people would only do as Jesus did, you'd almost have to eliminate the whole capitalist philosophy of life. Saskatchewan was booming. In 1930, its population was more than 900,000. That year, Douglas arrived in a 5-grain elevator town called Weyburn. It changed his life. Weyburn's Calvary Baptist Church hired Douglas as pastor at $1,800 a year. It was his first experience leading a prairie congregation.
When people congregated, it was one of the subjects that everybody had in common and could work on. It wasn't, the crops and the weather and the curling and politics.
The talk of politics in Depression years was the CCF, a federation of farmers and trade unions. CCFers in 1933 wrote their party platform in Regina. They called it a manifesto. It said capitalism must be ousted and replaced with state planning. Members marched in solidarity, they said, with the working class. In Depression years, a quarter of Canadian workers were unemployed.
But wait, what's this? Gates closed, no help wanted, no jobs? These are scenes of bitter memory.
We can't live unto ourselves. And that was more evident in the early days than it is today. People are quite self-sufficient today, but in those days they weren't.
Yes, a rich Life can be one for every Canadian family in the years to come.
In its slogans, opponents feared the CCF seemed as radical as the Communist Party. Socialism, read a liberal ad, was the stepping stone to dictatorship.
The agrarian has suffered. The manufacturer has suffered. The farmer has suffered.
Conservative Prime Minister Richard Bennett lamented the Depression, but said the CCF went too far. Said Bennett, it was almost Soviet in its character.
It is true that these were the kind of name calling that took place. The additional name that they were trying to attach to the CCF is communist.
In condemning capitalist profits, Douglas said later, some of our people were pretty close to the communists. He told one CCFer, they didn't want to go all the way out to taking orders from the Soviet Union, but they were pretty far left. Doris Nielsen, the Saskatchewan CCFer, elected MP for North Battleford, was secretly a member of the Communist Party. She was kept under police surveillance. Years later, Nielsen left Canada to spend her final years in Maoist China. In Saskatchewan, Douglas first campaigned at age 29. The Depression, he said, swept away most preconceived notions of how things should run. Douglas, as a young man, had notions he would rarely speak of later.
I don't think the average voter knew Tommy Douglas. They saw the image of Tommy Douglas that he wanted them to see.
In 1934, in a CCF periodical, Douglas wrote of youth and the new day. The Weyburn clergyman proposed a program of eugenics, the sterilization of people deemed subnormal. The unsound, he wrote, should not be a burden to society. Douglas, in his 1933 master's thesis, wrote of the problems of the subnormal family, including moral delinquents, he said, like single mothers. He favored segregation of the unfit. As an MP, first elected in 1935, Douglas quietly dropped his interest in eugenics. As Premier, he would never introduce it. Instead, in campaign pamphlets, Douglas pledged CCF stood for Children Come First. Saskatchewan would elect the first socialist government in the country. It happened through one extraordinary event. Afterward, as Premier, Douglas said, people must sense a need for change before it comes. They sensed it in Saskatchewan, but it took a war.
I found, to my surprise, a tremendous amount of expectation when I came home. Now, I had gone overseas in 42, I came back in 45. And I couldn't get over how keen politically people were compared with before.
For many members of the Canadian Army, Victory Year means the end of soldiering and a return to City Street. Many more will stay until the job is finished or until transport is available to carry them across the Atlantic. The repatriation schedule is operating in high gear. Loading by day and by night, by aircraft carrier, troop ship, destroyer, or stately liner, Canadian service people are returning to their own shores. As they leave the momentous year 1945 behind them, all know the triumph they bought with their confidence will mean a leading place for Canada in the world of tomorrow.
Wartime Gallup polls reported CCF gains. Once it was considered a fringe group. Now 53% of voters wanted change.
For someone to come along and say, yes, you've done the right thing, I agree with you, I can help, we can not only stave off disaster, but we can have a bright future.
In 1944, after serving 2 terms in the House of Commons, Douglas returned to Saskatchewan and won the CCF leadership. There, a supporter said, he'd become a folk figure.
And side by side we'll swell the tide, CCF to victory.
It would take us forever to go from, this is in Weyburn, to go downtown to get the mail. And my mother used to say, now hurry up, please, both of you, be back because we're going to have lunch. And we would go, but every 25 feet, somebody would stop him. And so we were quite late getting back. And I was like 5 or 6. And my mother said, I don't know why it takes you so long to get down there and back. And I said, because we had to CCF all the way down and we had to CCF all the way back.
June 15th, 1944, Saskatchewan elected the first CCF government in the country. Tommy Douglas won 53% of the vote. It was the biggest Saskatchewan majority in a generation.
I've been around politicians now for 50 years, and I like politicians. A lot of people don't like them. I like them, and it's partly because I was one, but I like them. And I never met one that I liked more and admired more than Tommy Douglas.
The Premier was 39, an unaffected man of plain habits. Douglas told a reporter, "You won't find me very interesting. I never do anything but work." His one indulgence was coffee with raisin pie. Troubled with ulcers, Douglas most of the time could stomach only boiled food and buttermilk. Smiling through banquets, he told a friend, was the politician's heaviest cross. "Everybody wants to feed you," he said. The Douglas family lived in a $6,000 house with a $4,000 mortgage. On his night off, the Premier liked taking his wife Irma to the movies or playing records at home.
I remember as a tiny child at the cottage, he had old phonograph records of the quartet from Rigoletto and the sextet from Lucia, and he would play them for me, and he would say, "Here comes Caruso."
Douglas developed a showman's personality. He could clown for the cameras with Roy Rogers. Once, visiting Hudson Bay, townspeople had Douglas ride in a dog cart. The Premier endured it with charm.
He was so personable. People really wanted to shake his hand and touch him. There was something magical about him.
He was good-humored. Welcoming a delegation from Russia, Douglas said, "You'll find Saskatchewan is like Texas, but more friendly to the United States." When praised as a saintly figure by supporters, he would bring them back to earth with a self-deprecating joke.
I felt something like the man on the resurrection morning who was reading his own tombstone and said, "Either somebody's an awful liar or I'm in the wrong hole."
Only weeks in office, in 1944, Douglas and his cabinet voted themselves a 29% pay cut. Then they got to work. They raised pensions and created Saskatchewan's first Department of Labor. It was only the beginning. Making his first appearance in the legislature, the Premier and caucus introduced 71 bills in 3 weeks. The Saskatchewan Assembly had never seen such an order paper. One bill established a welfare department. Another raised the minimum wage. In one initiative, the CCF proposed to grant workers 2 weeks paid holiday every year, the first bill of its kind in Canada. Saskatchewan would become the first to enact a Bill of Rights and legislate the 44-hour work week. Farmers were promised electricity in most every homestead and village. It was a huge undertaking in a territory the size of France.
Electricity actually changed the life of Saskatchewan. Tommy Douglas was elected on the promise that he would electrify Saskatchewan, and he did, very quickly. And it just made all the difference in the world, how people lived.
Another difference, promised the CCF, was plans for health. Saskatchewan introduced public hospital insurance. Basic care was provided for a $5 fee.
And want it, but because it will set the pattern for other social security measures, both here in Saskatchewan and elsewhere in Canada.
Douglas said, people appreciate something if they've paid for it. If you give people a card from Santa Claus, entitling them to free hospital services, it's not good psychology.
I opposed the idea because I thought that the burden of utilization or deterrent fees is going to really fall on the low-income people.
In 1959, Douglas proposed a compulsory prepaid health plan the country would come to know as Medicare. 60% of Saskatchewan residents would vote against it.
I think the legacy is to a very considerable extent overblown.
In launching its CCF program, the legislature increased spending more than 20% in its first term. To pay for it, said Douglas, taxes must rise. The sales tax eventually grew from 2% to 5%. Treasurer Clarence Fines used extra revenue to balance the budget, 15 years in a row. Fines said, it was hard, but we did it. Afterward, a colleague recalled, in the mindset created by the CCF, the values of the farm and small town were held as almost sacred. Saskatchewan would tolerate no less. The Premier's official car was a Dodge. Douglas would not use a Cadillac. At the office, the Premier promised to answer every letter. He said, it lets you know what the people's complaints are. In office, the CCF no longer spoke of abolishing capitalism. Instead, it embarked on the most sweeping campaign of public ownership the country had ever seen. Douglas called it our struggle for economic democracy.
When I moved to Regina and started working in the Cooperation and Markets branch, that's when I learned about credit unions. And it was really quite an exciting time in that office because the credit union movement was just starting.
In small towns, credit unions were celebrated as an expression of community spirit. By 1955, Saskatchewan had nearly 300 credit unions province-wide.
In a credit union, we go out, we get the dimes and nickels and dollars, but we pool them and make loans to ourselves. So when you come to town, come and see the treasurer. You can sign a pledge to save a little money each month. You can have a share. When you get a $5 share, you might be able to borrow up to $25. An ordinary person should have a standard of living to command the respect of his fellow men. As individuals, we are entitled to this. And through the credit union, we're going to work to this end. Come and see us when you come to town.
I can remember going to meetings and listening to the politicians and the people. And this was their attitude. We may not be NDPers or CCFers, but we will vote for that man because he does things.
Douglas said, a person has to be pretty unintelligent to think a government could run everything. His government would run many things. It created the Saskatchewan Bus Transportation Company. The venture put taxpayers in busing, said Douglas, because the Greyhound people only operated between the main cities. For those who drove a car, Douglas introduced state auto insurance, a program so new the CCF assured drivers they were covered even if they left the province.
Saskatchewan motorists have the benefit of this insurance when driving in Canada and the United States. Their insurance costs around $10 a year on the average, the lowest priced auto insurance in the world.
Regulation spread. Douglas created public boards to market Saskatchewan fur, then fish, and wool. Saskatchewan Wool Products was a government blanket factory. It cost taxpayers nearly $1 million before the venture failed in 1957. Some others would follow.
really the government experimented, and most of the times they were successful, and at times they were not successful. So that's true of private industry as well.
Unsuccessful was a Prince Albert box factory, expropriated after the owner would not recognize a union. Workers kept their jobs at public expense. A Regina tannery put taxpayers in the shoe business. It created 150 jobs, but turned no profits.
Tommy Douglas was the next speaker. He said the cooperative movement offered hope for a better life to the people of the world, and to youth in particular. From the Cooperative Union of Saskatchewan, he said, comes inspiration, co-op education and guidance. Study groups and farm forums point the way forward to a brighter world. When people act as a group, they are indestructible and invincible.
The CCF and Tommy Douglas were really, I think, after a real socialist province. They wanted, according to me and my thoughts, they wanted to run the province and guide my life. I didn't want that. I wanted to guide my own life. And lots of people are like that.
The CCF would remain a uniquely Saskatchewan experience. No other province would elect a CCF government. In 1961, as the only socialist premier in Canada, Douglas left Saskatchewan to lead the New Democratic Party. He said once he would put the flag of socialism on Parliament Hill. Douglas would never become Prime Minister. New Democrats would never win with Douglas in 4 successive elections. Twice, Douglas lost his own seat in the Commons and never regained the influence he had as Premier of Saskatchewan.
My expectation was that Douglas would win and that he would make a real impact on public life and politics across Canada, and that we would probably see Douglas before his retirement from politics as probably leader of the opposition. I half suspected, proved not to be true, that politics in Canada would realign.
Leaving Saskatchewan, Douglas said, "I hope the record will show that I served the people not too badly." He would never live here again. Douglas retired to Ottawa and was buried there at his request.
There isn't the same community spirit that there was years ago. We lose a great deal. In unity there is strength, isn't there? It just didn't turn out the way these great cooperators had hoped it would.
Repeat the last line. Take it easy, brother. This